Hey there, I'm Stan Baker, one of your hosts for Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. And this week, our podcast is about restorative leadership and social justice. I know it sounds like a heavy topic, but what's interesting to me is that every leader can be restorative and can deal with these social justice issues. And what we talk about is that you can do this in very simple and restorative ways. Listening to understand is a good example of this. I think it's important to talk about this because we often go into conflict situations with restorative practices after something has happened, looking to resolve the conflict, and many times neglect the social justice or structural issue that sits around the conflict. So if you're wondering how to do this as part of your restorative leadership, this podcast is for you. And here's a heads up. There's some really practical things. First off, make time to listen. Second, be open to hearing what other people say. And third, separate yourself from the issue. It's not personal. If you want to find out more about restorative practices, check out our website, www.restorative.ca or www.circleforum.ca. Now let's head over to the conversation already underway with Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan. This week, we're going to be talking about restorative leadership and social justice. And Steve, you've encountered a situation where you're being asked to speak to this in a conference. And I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of a background about what this conference is about, or even just the topic.
Sure. The topic is social justice and restorative mindsets. That's my thesis or my topic for this speech I'm giving on. And so I started looking at, okay, social justice. I'm aware of a lot of social justice issues. We've talked a lot about certain issues on this podcast before, but how does that work in relation to a restorative mindset?
Social justice issues. What do you mean by social justice?
Well, the, the concept of social justice really talks about, does everybody in society have a fair and equal opportunity to participate in society? Do they have equal access to opportunities for jobs, health, wealth, wellness, all those things? And if they don't, then that becomes a social justice issue. That systemic racism that exists for years and still exists, it is a social justice issue. The whole Black Lives Matter falls under that category. So there's a lot of things that when society as a whole has a system in place that denies people rights or opportunities, that becomes a social justice issue.
So what isn't it? Like, what are some of the misconceptions or misinterpretations of social justice?
I guess the biggest misconception that I've found in some of my reading is that some people just will deny that some of those things exist. So the whole concept of systemic racism, and in the States, state governments denying people the chance to have those conversations in schools. They don't want it taught. They don't want people to acknowledge that systemic racism exists. That's probably the thing that people will say, there's no such thing as social justice issue. We're all created equal. It might be all created equal, but you don't have all the same opportunities. So there are those, call them deniers, if you will, or people that just simply don't have the facts. Could be the other piece too. But they don't see a lot of social justice issues as the people that are maybe involved in that group see it themselves, or the people that are affected by that. It's hard for you and I, Stan, to talk about some gender issues because we are not of the female perspective, but we can at least acknowledge that they're there. But a lot of people won't acknowledge it.
When we're talking systemic in the work that we've done in schools with restorative practices or conflict resolution, it's usually been very targeted, and that we may see bigger issues, but I guess the next layer of that is the people doing that work, are they given permission, or is it safe to then say, hey, system, have a look at this. This is just not about this incident. And I don't know, that certainly didn't necessarily exist when I was working in education just a few years ago. And I would be challenged to think that it's there, that who's doing this day-to-day work could say, I know the language is there, but I don't think we're doing it. And hold a mirror up a bit. And that may be a piece that's still missing, I would think.
It's tough to hold that kind of mirror up to yourself as a leader in a school system and to recognize, there's something here that's not fair. And I think my experience too was that I often was asked to come in to fix a situation or a problem. I was on speed dial for conflicts with parents, for example, just solve the conflict. And often what would happen is that I wouldn't even hear back from the person who asked me to solve the conflict. They would just, as long as the problem went away, they were satisfied. So there was one case in particular where a student, basically he was an A student involved in sports in grade 9, and the beginning of grade 10, he just dropped off the radar in terms of attending school and participating in sports. And people noticed that, and people tried to reach out. But when I heard about what was going on, because there was some concern that he had some suicidal ideation and so on, and basically got to the point where they said he's been gone for 15 days. We tried to reach him. We sent his parents a letter, and now we're going to demit him, and he's not our problem anymore. And I just kind of, holy smokes. And the system that I bumped up against was, all right, he gets dumped onto the criminal justice system, the community mental health system, but he's still our kid. He's still our kid.
We're not getting money for him now.
Exactly.
Yeah. And on a smaller scale, that's the same type of attitude you run into with teachers in schools. Well, that's not my student. So why do I have to deal with that kid in the yard or whatever? He's not my student. I teach grade 4 and he's in grade 5. But they're all, so we always say, but they're all our students.
Yeah.
And so to your point, Stan, yeah, he's not our student anymore, but he's society. He lives in our society.
Yes, he's
What are
our.
we going to do to deal with him in society? If you live on your street, what would you do about it?
Yeah. So how does a restorative mindset start to address that lack of fairness or equity in this one particular case?
I mean, you have to think back of what is restorative. A mindset, people have mindsets, whether it's a punitive mindset. We always talk about the punitive versus restorative. If they have a punitive mindset, but it's more than that. What restorative is a participatory process. And there's a lot of people who don't feel that they need to have people participate. Other people will make that decision, and that's good enough. We elected you to make a decision, and I'll respect your decision, or I'll at least criticize if I don't like it, but I don't want to be part of it. So we lose that whole participatory piece in society that we expect other people to do the work. And yet people all want to be heard. And they scream to be heard, but they don't want to participate in the process. They want other people, they basically want to be heard after the fact, not during the fact. And that's a bit of a problem too. So we have to somehow create a mindset in society that your participation in society is important, that you have something that's worth saying, even if it's a dissenting opinion, it's worth saying, it's worth hearing. Gone are the days of public forums and people standing on the street corners giving speeches on a soapbox. And I remember when I first moved to this town years and years ago, there was a public issue about a garbage dump and were they going to expand the local garbage dump and bring all the garbage up from Oshawa. And the public outcry was huge. And so they had public meetings. They hosted public meetings. So they wanted to hear from people. So I went to the one public meeting, and apart from the politicians who were there was maybe 10 people there, apart from myself. So after all the politicians and the people from the waste disposal people all gave their opinions and whatnot, talked about the data and whatnot, they turned and they said, does anybody have any questions? You could have heard a pin drop. So there was an opportunity for public participation, but nobody picked it up. I would suggest that if they did it more often, people will eventually get into that habit.
To trust again on what's happening there. If I use my voice and speak up, am I going to be seen as a troublemaker? Am I going to be made to do something rather than I just had a thought or something I wanted to share, but now all of a sudden I'm expected to lead this or take it somewhere? It's that flattening the hierarchy that we've talked about before, right? Can I have a voice, or what limit is my voice? And how is that going to impact me if I've spoken out in a way that's not seen as acceptable or as going against the system, rather than the curious or have we thought about this before? I have to feel safe that it's going to be seen as that too.
And it also takes time for the citizenry, the people who want to participate, to see that their voice will be heard.
That's right.
If you go and you say a few things and they say, thanks very much, and they do the opposite, that's the fair process. Okay, they did the opposite, but at least I had a chance to express it, I think. But then they never did the other two E's. They never explained it. And they never told us what the expectations were afterwards. They just said, okay, we're going to give you a chance. So after a while, people say, what's the point of going? They're not really listening. But so over time, they have to listen to people. They have to go through that fair process and explain things. And over time, people will say, you know what? People are listening to us, because a little few things do trickle through. They did listen to me when I made that point, or they listened to the guy down the street when he made that point. So they will start to learn that there's value in participating. But we've lost that whole concept of participatory democracy, if you will. That to me is the root of a lot of restorative processes, is that everyone gets a voice.
I think part of what comes up for me is social justice in restorative practice within the structure or the system. In our case, it's the educational system. And do you have permission to actually raise the question? And what happens if you do raise the question? There have been situations where I've raised questions and people have said, listen, that's not your job.
Absolutely.
That's not your job. You're not even supposed to be in. And if you go to another one of these meetings, there's going to be hell to pay. And you think, okay, so part of, I think, restorative leadership in dealing with these social justice issues, to me, is just having an open ear to the kinds of things that come up from the people that you work with. So if somebody raises a question, that you actually have the opportunity to give them a hearing, whether or not it's going to go anywhere. Everybody has lots of ideas about what everybody else should be doing, but to really be tuned in to listening for situations that are different than the way we're doing things. And maybe you'll act on it, maybe you won't. But the difference is just being heard in that particular process. I can't tell you how many leaders within the systems that I've worked in said, it's just not safe, okay, for my career, for me personally, to raise this issue. So I'm going to duck and I'm going to wear beige. I don't want to stand out. And we've had a lot of leaders leave systems because they didn't duck and their heads were taken off and they weren't listened to. And these are good people who really cared and were interested in social justice issues, but did not have the opportunity to be heard. And so for a restorative leader or restorative mindset, it is constantly listening for that dissonant sound to at least hear the person out.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I was doing some work on communication. I did a communication workshop not too long ago for a different group.
Steve, you are the workshop king. Can I
am.
say this here?
I am.
Okay.
And part of it was, of course, part of communication is listening. And we got into talk about active listening. And so I was doing some reading on what is active listening and that kind of stuff. And came across this article that broke down listening as into 3 different types of listening. And there's some fancy words, and I wrote them down because I thought it might come up in our conversation today. But the one that they really promote is called apoplectic listening. And apoplectic listening is opposite of compassionate listening and cataphatic listening. Cataphatic listening.
So listen to you go here, man.
This is all new to me. And I thought it was new to me. The words were new to me, but the concepts weren't.
Right.
But compassionate listening is active listening, where you are focused on the listener. You're paraphrasing, you're trying to say I hear what you're saying is this, and clarifying and so on through. But you're only listening, you're listening actively, but you're not listening to do anything about it. You're there to help the other person, and maybe they feel better. It's a cathartic thing. Cataphatic listening is the opposite, where I'm only listening so I can get my own opinion in. I'm waiting for an opportunity to tell you why you're wrong and I'm right, and here's my opinion on it.
I've never worked with people like that.
No,
just so you know, never.
But apoplectic listening is active listening, but through questioning, trying to gain a deeper understanding of what it is the person is talking about and what it is they truly believe. And is it different than what I believe? And let's have a conversation about our differences. And maybe I can get a better understanding of why I believe what I do. and why you do what you do. And so affective listening is that deeper questioning to try and gain better understanding of a topic. So we talk about social justice issues, and you want to do a classroom circle, you're a grade 11 world studies teacher, and you want to have a classroom circle to talk about some issue. And the article I read was basically saying, if we can teach kids affective listening skills, they will be better at understanding those issues than simply teaching them to be quiet and listen. It's more than just sitting there and not saying anything. It's about the question and answer and teaching them how to ask the right questions to gain better understanding without coming across as being uh,
Like you're
angry
interrogating. Yeah.
or arrogant or whatever. There's
Yeah.
ways to do it. I thought it was quite interesting because it fits into this full concept of social justice. If you and I stand as white males, middle-aged and middle-class males want to sit in a room with a, a lot of black people to find out about the black experience in Canada, we're going to have to do a lot of apoplectic listening. And hopefully the rest of the people in that group will understand the questions we are asking are not to be critical, but for us to gain understanding. Because sometimes it can come across as you ask a question, is it, do you mean that people think that you're criticizing them? Or
That's the delivery part. That's the delivery part.
well, it's a skill, right? There's a
That's
definite
right.
skill to it. But if you really want to gain an understanding of somebody else's lived experience, then you're going to have to ask them some questions, not just listen to them, but to get that deeper understanding. So to me, that it ties in with the social justice and restorative because all that can be put together into one classroom circle, if you will.
And part of that, I think, too, is how we approach leaders, because often what happens is we're approaching the leader in order to make a decision. And it's a persuasive sort of thing. And the leader feels like, okay, now you're asking, since I'm the leader, the designated leader in the school as a principal or in the system as a superintendent or director. So I've got to come up with a decision and decide yes or no to whatever it is that you're raising. And what we're saying here is that a restorative leader needs to focus more on the listening rather than on having to make a decision.
I had a superintendent like that many years ago who was on reflection was not just a good listener, but really did ask some questions because he was truly interested in finding out what people were thinking. And he would start off, I mean, we use this all the time and I never really thought about it, but he would start off with, help me to understand what you're talking about. Tell me to understand what you mean by, and so he would start with that starting phrase most times because it told the other person that they weren't asking a question to criticize. They were really truly trying to understand. Help me to understand your position and why it's so different than mine. And he was great. He would listen and listen and then go away and think about it and come back again and super leader and went on to become director of education in a number of different school boards in Ontario and is now working in the States. A fantastic leader because he listened, he asked questions and he truly listened to the responses.
So, what are some specific things that we can suggest for people who are in positions of leadership who want to be restorative leaders with social justice issues?
For the superintendent level or that level, they certainly need to think about how they listen to people and how they ask questions and what is the purpose for asking those questions and listening. Are they actually making time for that? Or are they just simply going ahead and uh, I'm too busy to sharpen the saw thing? And to me, they do need to make that time. If there's an issue that's coming along, they need to make the time to ask the people who are involved. And if it means giving license to teachers to have those tougher conversations with the kids in their classroom, then what supports do we have to put in place and what trainings and resources do we have to put behind that? Because the people at the top can make those decisions to a degree. And it's a priority thing, really, sometimes.
I think continually being open that there might be things in a system that need to shift or change or language, or just because you wrote that policy and procedure, maybe there's something in there that could be just somebody wants to ask or look at it in a different way, that it's not an attack on you, that things do shift and change. And being open just to hear that, or being that somebody can just say, okay, we've said this in this policy, but this is how we're actually doing it. Being able to hear that, not as a critique of you personally, but maybe it's a systemic thing that we need to have a bigger look at.
I love how both of you are really saying separate yourself from the issue. So that's a big part of what we talk about in restorative practice and in restorative leadership, that we separate speech from the speaker, if you will, in this case, or the action from the actor, that we're able to distinguish those kinds of things. And another thing that I would add is be open to the possibility that things are different than they appear to you. You know this, Shelley, in dealing with violence threat risk assessment. Go into the situation and you think, oh, this is what's going on. And then you realize after you hear some other things that are going, okay, this is different. So just be open to the possibility that things are different than they appear to you. Listening sounds so simple, and yet it takes practice and hard work. People will notice your leadership, just like Steve's story about a leader that he worked with, who he noticed in terms of how this person listened, thought about it, came back, asked questions, and really listened to understand. You can learn more about restorative practices and restorative leadership with some resources from our website, www.restorative.ca, our podcast, Circle Forum, or circleforum.ca. And let's keep practicing listening to understand with both our ears. We've got two of them after all.